Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the next session of the TeTra Joint Research Seminar. It is my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Benjamin Sharkey, who is currently pursuing his DPhil in history at the University of Oxford. His doctoral research explores Syriac Christian society and experiences in medieval Central Asia during the period of Islamization from the 10th to the 14th centuries. And today he's going to be speaking about literacy, transmission, and translation, the epigraphic evidence of an East Syriac community in Mongol-era Kyrgyzstan. Benjamin, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much. Can I share the screen now? Very good. Is that coming up all right? Great, fantastic. Yeah, thank you so much all for coming. And thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me along to share with you bits of my research. I hope it'll be interesting, and I very much look forward to all your questions at the end. So to kick off, in the summer of 1885, several inscribed stones were brought to the attention of a Mr. Pantusov of the Russian Imperial Turkestan Civil Service. Found on the outskirts of the new city of Pishpek, that is today's Bishkek, the capital of Kyrgyzstan. These stones were they each bore a carved cross alongside curious writing in an unknown script. Within a couple of months, Pantusov had begun excavating at a couple of sites within the valley. And across excavations between 1885 and 1892, over 600 such gravestones were recovered, many of them still in situ, being used as headstones in a cemetery containing several thousand graves. The crosses seem to identify these as Christian gravestones, but the script was still quite a mystery and a challenge. Pantusov had images shown to several Kalmuk Buddhist lamas, but only when rubbings and photos of the gravestones were eventually sent to the Academy in St. Petersburg was the language identified, perhaps as you will already have guessed, as Syriac. And by 1897, most of the inscriptions had been published and translated into German by Daniel Troelsen, a Russian Jewish scholar of Semitic languages in St. Petersburg. Since then, nearly 100 more Syriac gravestones have been discovered at various sites across the region, and new stones continue to be turned up all the time. Meanwhile, the majority of those documented by Troelsen have been lost in the various intervening periods of turbulence around the collapse of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. Initially, the gravestones inspired widespread scholarly interest, and individual stones made their way into various European collections in Britain, France, Germany, and Finland. So here are two of the stones that are in the UK at the moment, one in the British Museum and one in Durham University. They're not on display, but you can get to see them in the collections. However, following the First World War, this scholarly attention across Europe rather evaporated, and only in recent decades really have similar levels of scholarly interest in the gravestones revived. So, dating from the early 13th to the mid 14th centuries, when Central Asia was under Mongol rule, and particularly under the Chaghatai dynasty, they are an incredibly valuable source on not just the history of Christianity in Central Asia, but I think of the social history of Central Asia and the Mongol-ruled world more generally. No comparatively large demographic sample exists for Central Asia until the 19th century period of Imperial Russian rule. Yet, as well as revealing much about the social workings of the Central Asian Christian community and the ethnic makeup of a Mongol Central Asian society, they offer us a glimpse into aspects of Central Asian Christian educational and textual culture and networks of transmission. And this will be the elements that I focus on today, which I hope will be of most interest to this particular group. First, though, I want to offer a bit of background on the community which the gravestones represent. Various sources refer to Christians arriving in the region of Central Asia, the region of present-day Turkmenistan and Afghanistan, between the 2nd and 6th centuries. while Christianity seems to have taken root in Sogdiana, which is present-day Uzbekistan, by at least the 7th century. The Church of the East, or the East Syrian Church, traditionally referred to as Nestorian, oversaw these communities through a series of metropolitan bishops sent out from the patriarchal seat in Mesopotamia. These were sent to cities such as Merv, an early Christian center, as well as Herat and Samarkand. Some of the first Turkic nomads seem to have converted in the 8th century. But throughout the Middle Ages, Christians were prevalent across Iranic and Turkic populations of Central Asia, only finally disappearing in around the early 15th century. In the Chuy Valley, the area of Kyrgyzstan containing Bishkek and the cemetery sites, Christianity seems to have been present among Sogdian and Turkic populations from at least the 8th century. 2 church sites so far have been identified, which are speculatively dated to have been active between the 9th and the 12th centuries. And the plans of these churches are, I think, visible on the screen. One is a particularly strange triple nave church, and the other is a very large single nave church. This, I think, then brings us to the gravestones. So here are some that are currently held in Burana Museum, which is very near Bishkek, about an hour's drive. So in the Chuy Valley, the area, a few of these gravestones have been dated to the late 12th and very early 13th century, but the vast majority date from after the 1240s. Most of the stones carry datings in both the Seleucid calendar and the Turkic 12 animal cycle zodiac. The Seleucid calendar was used across the Church of the East, as well as by Central Asian Jewish communities, and begins in around 312, 311 BC, with Alexander the Great's general Seleucus Nicator's entry into Babylon. But this specific origin is clearly not understood by the local community, which delightfully describes the date as the year of Alexandros Khan. Alongside a date, most stones also carry the name of the deceased and then a title denoting their relation to the church. So either an ecclesiastical role or the title Mahaimna, or believer, probably designating a layperson. A relative is also sometimes recorded, as on the stone on the screen, and occasionally a demonym or a nisba denoting where they come from. Again, most of the stones are written in Syriac, although a few are written in a local Turkic vernacular, although this is written in a Syriac script. And one stone, that on the screen at the moment, even has a bilingual inscription in Armenian and Syriac. To start with then, we have the presence of literacy visible among the community in both Syriac and Turkic. And clearly their Turkic literacy is coming from a background of Syriac literacy, hence being written in the Syriac script. The Syriac itself is far from perfect, with a number of recurring grammatical errors. So for instance here, when expressing the relation of possession, as in the grave of X, while the pronominal suffix he is used, it is never followed by the necessary particle dola. It has been suggested in relation to Arabic language gravestones in Central Asia from a slightly earlier period, that when such grammatical errors occur, it's in cases when the grammar departs significantly from that of the local vernacular. So in the case of those gravestones, Arabic departing from Tajik grammar. I think this holds true in the case of these stones as well. In this particular one, the Karluk Turkic languages, a genitive suffix ning is used, as in the Syriac with the he, but no genitive particle is necessary. So hence they've omitted that in the Syriac as well. The gravestones also offer clues, I think, as to how members of the community acquired literacy. So some 42 individuals are identified by the title Eskolaya, meaning scholar or student. Another 9 are listed as Malfana, teachers, and there are also 4 with the title Mafashkana, or exegets. These are all titles usually identified with East Syrian schools. So where Eskolaya would be taught by Malfane and Mafashkana would serve as heads of the institutions and as instructors at the higher levels. As such, the presence of so many students and what is probably a continuity of exegetes, so one exegete taking over from another, suggests the presence of a school in the Chuy Valley community. At least in Mesopotamia, teaching in such East Syrian schools was primarily oriented first around Syriac literacy and then biblical literacy, concluding with the reading and finally writing of theological and biblical commentaries. So here, the literacy displayed in the gravestones was most probably the product of this school. Other fragmentary evidence too suggests the presence of schools in other locations throughout the region. So for instance, this gravestone from the site of Al-Malik, which was the Mongol-Chaghatai administrative capital, today situated in Xinjiang province in western China. This stone mentions Nestorius, the Mafashkana and Exegiste, who died around 1301. This gravestone is almost uniquely decorated. It's very richly decorated, and the imagery evokes other gravestones, particularly those of Christians from China. This fragment of paper from the Turfan oasis, so again in Xinjiang further to the east, also mentions the names of 6 escolae, so scholars or students. This fragment is one of over 1,000 Christian manuscript fragments recovered from this site in the Turfan oasis. The presence then of a school with students learning literacy, often by copying texts, teachers teaching by reading aloud from other texts, and exegetes working with commentaries, evidences the presence of a textual culture in the Chuy Valley community. And the collection of manuscripts in Turfan, I think, can give us some indication of what this textual culture would have looked like. So, dating from between the 8th and 14th centuries, most of the manuscripts from Turfan are in either Syriac or Sogdian, with a significant overlap between the two in the form of bilingual works. And there are some later Mongol-era fragments that are in Uyghur Turkic. They nearly all preserve copies or translations of texts that originated in Mesopotamia and had been transmitted to them via Western Central Asia, likely through centers such as Merv, Samarkand, and even probably the Chuy Valley. Translation is the most notable activity taking place there. However, we see lectionaries, psalters, hymns, creeds, prayers, and hagiographies translated into Sogdian, the local vernacular lingua franca used in this region perhaps until the 11th century. And from the Mongol period, there is also a psalter, a legend of the Magi, and a martyrdom of St. George translated into Uyghur. All this translation work served in some way to make the key narrative elements of salvation history accessible to even the illiterate through the church service. Similar translation work was probably forming part of the literacy activity in the school in the Chuy Valley. The use, I think, of the Syriac alphabet to write Turkic, noted on several of the stones, such as the one in front of you, suggests an independent development of Turkic literacy by Central Asian Christians. Maybe here, maybe not here, but in the wider region. It might also be noted, I think, that the Turkic vernacular here is being used in an otherwise predominantly Syriac space, one which we might compare to the church service, where the liturgy across the Church of the East remained in Syriac. But as we've seen, key elements such as scripture, hymns, and creeds were translated into local languages. A similar observation has been made of Muslim Arabic gravestones in Central Asia, in which the Kufic and Nash scripts echo those used in contemporary Quranic and theological manuscripts, so suggesting the gravestone as this sort of almost liturgical place. Such translation work as a form of exegesis in itself may well have been the purview of the Mafashkana, here taking the space of interpretation that more original composition and commentary writing may have filled elsewhere. Finally, then, I want to look at the Chuy Valley's community's engagement with a wider network of connections and how this allows us to retrace paths of transmission across Central Asia. At least 4 gravestones identify the deceased with specific endonyms. Sorry, I've lost my place. With specific endonyms. So these include various locations, various peoples across the Mongol Empire. One is identified as a Uyghur, another as a Mongol, and two as Chinese, both using different terms. One, the typical Syriac Sinai, the other, the Turkic Tabgach. So Uyghur Christians, as well as Uyghurs more generally, became increasingly widespread across the Mongol Empire in the wake of the conquests. The Uyghurs had been one of the first kingdoms to surrender to the Mongols, and as such, they were rewarded with important positions in the Mongol administration, although their role was also one of great necessity to the Mongols, as they lent the Mongols both their literacy and their experience governing non-nomadic settled populations. Indeed, the Mongol script was itself developed by a Uyghur from the Uyghur script. Itself developed from Sogdian, which had its origins in Imperial Aramaic. Uyghur Christians' inscriptions appear in the period as far afield as Yunnan in southeast China and in northern Mesopotamia, such as that on the monastery illustrated. To be identified on these gravestones by these titles, these identities must have continued to mark these individuals as distinct. So as Uyghur, as Mongol, as Chinese, even within the Chuy Valley community, even if they themselves had not immigrated, if they weren't first-generation immigrants. Their presence on the gravestones during this period, I think, very much seems to link the expansion of connections among Christian communities, which the Mongol imperial system allowed. So it shows the way that the Chuy Valley fitted in with this sort of expanding horizon created by the Mongol Empire. There are also a number of graves with demonyms identifying the origins of the individuals as being in nearby cities of regional importance. So 7 of these identify individuals from Al-Malik, including 4 priests and 1 chorepiscopos, that is, an ecclesiastical visitor. Another identifies a woman from Kashgar. Al-Malik is a significant connection, as this was the new Mongol-Chaghatai capital from which the Chuy Valley would have been governed, replacing the pre-Mongol capital of Balasakhun, which was located in the Chuy Valley. And these are the remains of Balasakhun in photo taken today. So there's a number of the gravestones that have been found in the Chuy Valley are connected to this site, which would have been one of the major cities in both the Karakhanid and the Kyrgyzstan empires, but prior to the Mongols. So as we've noted, a number of gravestones have also been found at Al-Malik. From the same period. The site has not been properly excavated either, and thorough investigation, I think, would almost certainly turn up significant more Christian gravestones. There have also been suggestions that there may have been a metropolitan bishop located in Al-Malik during this period. Kashgar, however, was a location with deeper connections to the Chuy Valley, having served along with Balasakhun as the twin capitals of the Eastern Karakhanid dynasty in the 11th and early 12th centuries. Kashgar too had its Christian community, as noted by Marco Polo. Indeed, Kashgar had certainly been home to a metropolitan from at least the 12th century, and by the 14th century seems to have been a two-centered province, with the metropolitan maintaining one seat at Kashgar and another in the Chuy Valley at a site called Navaka. Quite how this relationship worked is unclear, whether the metropolitan spent part of the year in one center and part in the other, but it's interesting, I think, to note that there are parallels here with how the Karakhanid capitals work, with one based in Kashgar and one in the Chuy Valley, and the Khan moving between the two. Such a mobile metropolitan could explain the presence, indeed, of so many ecclesiastical visitors recorded among the gravestones, clergy who would have gone out and visited more remote communities or could have helped to maintain connections between these two centers. So I think also the presence of the metropolitan may have been quite important in the foundation of a school, as this seems to be one of the main things metropolitans are charged with when they're sent out. Such metropolitans were always sent out from the church center in Mesopotamia, as they had to be selected and ordained by the hand of the patriarch. They were seemingly often the only members of the Christian community in Central Asia that had come from Mesopotamia. And as such, they played an important role at keeping the constituent communities of the church connected. They may well have been important transmitters of texts in their own right as well, so bringing texts directly from Mesopotamia to some of these Central Asian communities. So in conclusion, while the gravestones inscriptions themselves, I think, offer only very limited details, still they offer some incredibly valuable insights on the life and society of Central Asian Christians during the Mongol period. They testify to the literacy in the community, to teaching activity and translation, while hinting at the presence of a rich textual culture. They also offer a view on the state connections between Christian communities within the Mongol Empire, paths along which texts were taken and transmitted from Mesopotamia as far as Tuafan in present-day Western China. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look very much forward to your questions and your feedback.
Thank you very much, Benjamin, for this fascinating talk on both textual and material culture, and for sharing your research on these gravestones with us. And the floor is now open for questions, so please feel free to raise your virtual hand. It's also possible to write questions in the chat, and we are available to read them for you if you are unable to talk. If I could start us off, perhaps, Benjamin, I was curious, do the gravestones largely reflect male communities and male contexts? Or have you seen indications of female names, female nouns, perhaps? You refer to a woman from Kashgar, for example.
Yeah, no, this is a great question. And I think it's one of the maybe notable features of the gravestones here. I mean, if you compare them to Muslim Arabic gravestones from Samarkand of a slightly earlier date. Oh, can I change the mic? Yes, maybe that's a good reminder.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yes. Please take your time to switch.
Very good. Is that better? Fantastic.
Thank you. Excellent.
Not a problem. No, thanks for the reminder. Yeah, so compared to Muslim cemeteries, Muslim gravestones of the same type in say Samarkand, there we see almost entirely they're represented. Oh, the time range. Yes. So the gravestones here represent the 13th to 14th centuries. So they all date from around, but between sort of 1201 and 1345. The gravestones in Al Malik go up to the 1360s. Most of them are, between this sort of 1240s, 1340s here. So yeah, some of the only comparisons we have, I suppose, of gravestone communities are these Islamic communities from further south. There's a lot less gravestones there, maybe more like 100, 200. But those are almost entirely male, and they're almost entirely clerics. This community, male clerics are massively overrepresented. They may be over a quarter. But there are a lot of women represented in the community. Maybe at least a third of the community is female. I think off the top of my head, that's my remembering. And a lot of them are lay people as well. So for a sort of stone gravestone community like this in Central Asia, women are significantly represented, as are lay people. There is an overrepresentation of, I suppose, clerical men. Probably is an overrepresentation of literate people as well. It's worth noting that the gravestones, there's about 600 gravestones from this one site, a bit more than that. And the estimations are that there were about 3,000 burials. So that's a significant amount of the population to be represented by stone gravestones compared to other sites as well. I suppose on the count of female representation, one thing that I think meant to include in the talk is this very interesting and I suppose mysterious title of kushtans, which is used on a good number of stones. Maybe a couple of dozen stones have this title, kushtans. It's not a Syriac title. It seems to be a Sogdian title, a sort of loan word being borrowed. In Sogdian, it can mean either teacher or elder. And on Christian Sogdian texts, it is used to mean teacher sometimes. So there's a hagiography of, no, it's a commentary. It's Dedishu Barkatraya's commentary found in Turfan, which uses this word kushtans to mean teacher, or it uses the male form kushte. Here it's used in the female form, and it's used predominantly on female graves. Quite what it means, whenever titles are used on the gravestones, they seem to indicate either, the individual's relationship to the church, so either an ecclesiastical title or the title layperson. So they seem to have some kind of ecclesiastical meaning. Do they mean elder? Do they mean teacher? Are these women involved in education? It's hard to tell, but they're very intriguing. Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, wonderful. Thank you so much. Please, Georgia.
Yay, thank you. Thank you very much. It was fascinating indeed. I have just very small follow-up. So do you see any formal difference in the, let's call it layout of the tombs between male and female, or some elements that are mentioned in one and not in the other?
Yeah, not really, not too much difference. They're all of a very similar quality. In some ways, this is kind of remarkable that whether you're a chorepiscopus or a laywoman, you seem to have generally a similar style and design. The amount of detail included sometimes varies. So, for instance, the scholars, the students, they have remarkably little detail on their gravestones, and this seems to be sort of universal among the students, that only about half of them even have a date, and they all just have the person's name and the title student. Whereas other gravestones will sometimes, quite frequently, have people's relatives. Usually the relatives are predominantly male, so someone's father or someone's husband, but not entirely. There are a couple that have female relatives and are identified by female relatives, which is, again, quite interesting. Yeah, I suppose you see say on the gravestones of the exegetes, these are notable again as particularly detailed stones. So they have particularly long epitaphs. Very few of the stones have epitaphs beyond these sort of basic details, but the exegetes seem to have these longer ones. So again, there seems to be quite a sort of very clear status thing going on in the gravestones of students and exegetes, but among the other population, it's much less clear. The stones are all of generally the same quality. The exegete at Al-Malik stands out as having a particularly fine gravestone, but nothing like that is found in the Chuy Valley. Great. I hope that sort of goes some way to answering it.
The next question is asked by Seth.
Benjamin, thank you for your talk. I was wondering about the graves themselves. Have any artifacts been recovered within the graves, either on the persons in them or beside them, whatever, that have any writing on them that could give further evidence of literary culture in these communities?
Great. Yeah, no, it's a good question. My knowledge of this is yeah, I suppose a little limited, but there have definitely been grave goods found with some of them. The ones I know about are predominantly articles of jewelry, beads, things like this. There are scraps of silk, brocade. I think even freshwater pearls have sometimes been found. These sort of stuff, I mean, particularly jewelry seems to be mainly associated with the graves of young people. So children and young people. And I think very few of the adult graves have grave goods. But this is stuff that I think there's more research to be done on. The excavations, when they were done in the 1880s and 90s, there was a lot of documentation produced, but I understand a lot of it is still sort of to be tracked down and looked at. It's all sort of contained in St. Petersburg. Yeah.
Thank you.
So no text, unfortunately, but yeah.
I give the floor to Manuel and after that to Mara.
Yes, thank you. Maybe you already said it and I missed it, but I have a question on the names of the gravestones. Are these all Syriac names, or do you also have names that are from Turkic or Sogdian origin? And if there are only Syriac names, what would this mean for the Christian community, that they still were like outside foreigners in the Central Asian area, or that when you also have Turkic such names, that they changed maybe the names and when they, let's say, converted to Christianity?
It's a very good question, and yeah, something I didn't talk about, but certainly can. The names are very interesting, and certainly one of the aspects where they do give us quite a lot of detail what kind of names are being used by a community like this. To massively oversimplify it, about half are Syriac names, about half are Turkic names. It's something around that. Clergy have Syriac names represented in slightly higher proportions, but certainly they're not all Syriac names. You also get names that are, there's quite a lot of names of Persian origin. There's even a few of Mongol origin. There's a couple, I think, that are sort of Arabic words. Yeah, but it's interesting that I think when, for instance, people look at Islamic communities in the region, it's quite common to look at these ways of tracing Islamization by looking at when Turkic names are exchanged for sort of more typical Muslim names. And I don't think you can do that quite as easily with this community. So, for instance, we have a lot of examples where a father with a Syriac name has a son who has a Turkic name or a Persian name. There's one example where we can trace 3 generations of a family, and the grandfather has a Turkic name, his son has a Syriac name, and his son has a Turkic name. I think maybe some of this can be explained in that a lot of the Turkic and Persian names being chosen potentially have a sort of Christian meaning to them as well. So they can mean stuff like fast or joy or things like this. But there's a lot that really don't have any sort of Christian meaning and are just very common local Turkic names. So it shows a community, yeah, the Syriac names would definitely mark them out as being definitely Christian in this environment. But they don't seem to be totally attached to just using Syriac Christian names. There are no examples, as far as I'm aware. I mean, maybe there are a couple, but it doesn't seem terribly common for people to have both a Syriac name and a Turkic name. That never seems to happen, which is something we see for Chinese Christians of the sort of earlier period, that they will have a Chinese name and a Christian name. Yeah, it's a great question though, and a great area of research, I think.
Mara, please.
Yeah. Hi, it was very informative. I learned a lot, so thank you so much. I have perhaps the silliest of questions, but so you mentioned the connection to East Syrian schools with regards to the name of the various trainers. So you mentioned the presence of the Mpashkana, so the exegete, and what was it, the other one, the Mahagiana, you said?
So there's some, and the Malfana and the Meshkana.
Right.
Yeah, so
Okay.
the teacher and the, yeah.
And the exegete. Okay, so there are no stones in which we find words like the Badoka or the Makliana, so the other members of the East Syrian schools that we know of, at least. I was interested in that, so thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I sort of assume that maybe these people are being just summed up as teacher. So Malfana is just being used more generally. For instance, this seems to be a case across maybe some of the other titles. So Kasha or Kashisha is used across loads of the stones priest, but there's no stone that has the title for deacon on it, for instance. There's a couple of archdeacons. There's a couple of very unique references to people like Kankaya, sort of sacristan, things like this. But generally, it seems quite rare. It seems maybe that they're using these more sort of catch-all terms for these sort of specific titles. Although, of course, there are these sort of interesting titles like Kushtans, which seem to be local innovations that have been used as well.
Can I follow up on that? Marion, you have a second? Right, so this might be my 9th century brain speaking here, but does it say anything about the society or the way in which, two titles usually belong way of, identifying people? So does it say anything about, I don't know, the educational system or how that changed? Because, I mean, again, this might come from my absolute ignorance for anything happened after the Euphrates, naturally. But I wonder, is there anything that we can gather from that?
Absolutely, and this is a very interesting question, and I think something I'm thinking a lot about at the moment. Yeah, I mean, my attempt to sort of understand these titles is absolutely using the models of Mesopotamian schools in, the 9th century. But we have very little indication that these schools are the same, except that they're using these sort of same titles, these heritage titles. And to understand what those titles mean to them, it helps to understand where those titles have come from. But we shouldn't assume that education remains or looks the same. It may become less complex. They may have less sort of individual titles for these roles. It may become a bit more informalized. They may indeed take in local aspects of education. So this title Kushtans could represent local kind of innovation. It's, why do you have to use a Sogdian word? Because there's not a Syriac word for it. Something like that. Really, it's very hard to tell quite what they're doing. You've got the Turfan manuscripts, which show kind of how people are engaging with literature, Central Asian Christians. But here it's much harder to tell. So yeah, it's really just using these titles to try and piece together what you have. You have references, of course, to the metropolitans, what they're going out and doing. So there are references to them bringing texts, teaching people. For instance, a lot of references to metropolitans teaching people to chant, things like that. There's one metropolitan that's selected by the Patriarch Timothy to go out to Herat because he's a specialist in logic. Whether he's then expected to go and set up a school and teach Aristotelian logic is another matter. But I think this is a very interesting question. So thank you.
If you wouldn't mind my jumping in again with another question. When it comes to the inscribing of the gravestones, should we imagine one particular workshop where everyone in the region goes, regardless of religious background? Or would you rather think of a more specific Christian context and style that really sets this community apart?
Yeah. In terms of the sort of paleography of these things, I don't know where to start with this. I'm not an expert on this at all. And Pierre Giorgio, who's on the call, has done a lot more on this with the gravestones. I think it's a good question. What sort of workshop is making these stones? Who are the people carving them? Are there multiple people? Can you detect hands across them? I think these are all good questions, which I personally don't have answers for. The community, though, in terms of its interaction with other communities in the region, it seems to be a majority Christian settlement, if not an entirely Christian settlement, maybe a semi-urban settlement by this point. The Chuy Valley had traditionally been, there's quite a lot of big cities, but by the Mongol period, these seem to have significantly deteriorated and people seem to have moved, spread out more in the valley. I think the Mongols bring a lot of stability in terms of reducing nomadic raiding, which allows people to form these sort of villages that are not walled and things like that. So the cemetery seems to be an entirely Christian cemetery connected to an entirely Christian settlement. We have in the Mongol-era historian, Rashid al-Din, I think, rather than Giovanni. Rashid al-Din mentions the presence of a town in the Chuy Valley called Tarsakent, which in Persian means Christian town. And so there's, I suppose, a temptation to try and link that to this site of this sort of very large, predominantly Christian site. The interaction with other communities is not very clear. There are a couple of stones that seem to suggest something about interaction with Muslims, but these are again not massively clear. I'm still sort of thinking about these and working on these, but it's a good question.
Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on this. Yeah.
Thank you.
There is a question by Gavin as well. Gavin, could I give you the floor, or perhaps I could read the question for you if you prefer?
Yes. Hey, Benjamin.
Hello.
The Syriac names that were found, were they predominantly clergy? In the case, for example, of the Syriac name of the parent and the Turkic child, is it possible that the clergy might have been Turkic and assumed ecclesiastical name upon becoming a priest or bishop? What are your thoughts on that possibility?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so the Syriac names are not strictly used by clerics. So we do have lay people with Syriac names. Syriac names are overrepresented among the clergy. So you can trace sort of the normal proportion of Syriac to Turkic names, but the majority of clergy have Syriac names, but it's by no means all the clergy. So that's kind of interesting, that the clergy are more likely to have Syriac names, but certainly we can't say either way that lay people don't have Syriac names or clergy don't have Turkic names. That's not the case, but there is a slight overrepresentation there. So there's something about name selection going on. Yeah, it's a good question.
I'm wondering if it could be that in the Church of the East, similar to the West, how when people assumed a ecclesiastical appointment, they assumed a name that was based of a saint. Because the question is, in my case, if Ili Balik, if Barshaba is relating to the Barshaba of Merv as an ecclesiastical appointed name.
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to tell. I think the fact that there are lots of clergy who don't have Syriac names means it's not a requirement. But the problem with the gravestones, of course, is that we only know what name they have when they die, right? What name they're sort of known by. So what name they were born with is not so clear. There is, of course, it's quite common for clergy to themselves have had clergy as parents. So is there something about clergy choosing Syriac names for their own children? Maybe so. I think one of the interesting things with the names is that that there's sort of high correlation between the names that you see represented here and the hagiographies you see represented at Turfan. It seems to be kind of the same selection of names. So I'm still sort of working out what to do with that. But it sort of seems that maybe they're engaging with the same saint stories. Maybe it represents a kind of narrowing a selection of saints that are being talked about. And Barshaba, as you know, is very much a popular saint in both locations, in the gravestones and in Turfan. No, thanks.
There's a comment from Gabriel Rabo in the chat.
It's very helpful.
I don't know, Gabriel, if you would like to elaborate.
Please, yeah.
If not, or perhaps later. Meanwhile, there is also another question by Georgia.
Yeah, thank you. You showed us a bilingual description, so I was wondering whether there's differences in the information recorded, or if you can tell us more about that as well. Thanks.
Yeah, this is a fascinating gravestone, and I'm currently working on a little publication about this for Andy. That Armenian Syriac crossover. It seems to be the only stone that's sort of bilingual in this way. Some of the others do mix sort of Turkic words, Turkic grammar, and Syriac words. But I think one of the very interesting things about this is it seems to be in two very different hands. The Syriac is the sort of same style, the same kind of inscription, with the same kind of detail that we have on the other gravestones. It matches up perfectly. But the Armenian is completely different. It's written in a very clear hand, not this sort of scroll. Clearly, there's a lot of effort put into it. It's clearly written by someone who is a native Armenian speaker, I think, rather than this Syriac, which is someone's sort of second language, which is interesting. It records the burial of an Armenian bishop, which is itself kind of interesting. There are no other bishops represented in the community. It uses the Armenian dating system alongside the Seleucid dating system in the Syriac inscription, I think. And the Armenian dating system is, I think, a little more precise on this stone. So that makes it kind of different. It seems to me that it must have been written by an Armenian companion of Bishop Yohanan, as well as by a local Syriac member. So it's interesting in the way it kind of testifies to the cooperation between Armenians and East Syrians here. I mean, we have sort of other sources on that kind of thing going on in the Mongol Empire. It seems to be good evidence to support the suggestions from very scant evidence on the Catalan atlas, so made in 14th century Mallorca, that there is a monastery of Armenians by Lake Issyk-Kul, so somewhere in the Kyrgyzstan region, which on the face of it seems maybe kind of mythical, legendary. But then you find an Armenian gravestone very nearby, and there's a bishop, and it seems like there are probably Armenian communities here. King Hethum of Armenia, he passes through the Chuy Valley when he's going from Karakorum to Armenia, so the Mongol capital to his kingdom. So it's very interesting, but it seems to be the product of interaction with a kind of another Christian community, an outside Christian community. So it's sort of a fascinating example, but I will definitely say more about that in future.
It is indeed fascinating. Mariam, can I ask another quick question?
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you. So it came to my mind hearing you talking now, and it comes from, it's a very silly question, but it comes from the fact that if you work with chronicles and you have multiple dating systems, the dating often doesn't match. So I was wondering whether in your tombstone, the Turkic and the Seleucid era always give, or mostly give, the same dating.
Yes, that's a very good question. The Turkic system, so it's like a sort of 12 cycle zodiac, so it doesn't give you a precise date. It just gives you which year in the 12th cycle they're in. So lots of gravestones, well, a few gravestones only have the Turkic zodiac and not the Seleucid. And these are sort of currently impossible to precisely date what year these are from. They could be from any number of years across this range. Whether the Seleucid and the Turkic ever clash is a great question, and I'm not sure I know off the top of my head if there are any examples of that. But something to look at. I have a feeling there might be, but I'm not sure. Yeah, I mean, how they're calculating this time is very interesting. The fact they're continuing to use the Seleucid calendar like the rest of the church is quite interesting. But the fact they're also mixing it with this local Turkic zodiac, even on the stones that are purely in Syriac, it's very interesting.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Are there any further questions? Would anyone like the chance to ask Benjamin a final question on the gravestones? If not, I propose that we thank our speaker for this many-sided talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and thank you everybody for joining also. See you next time.
Thanks, everyone. Have a nice day.